All right, now it's time to start the webinar. Hi, welcome to today's event. Today we'll be discussing how to build a successful innovation program. My name is Erkka Isomäki. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Bhima, and today's topic is actually one of my favorites, as I love to think about and discuss the factors that affect the overall success of an innovation program together with our customers. With me is Jesse. Could you say a few words about yourself as well?
Sure. So I'm Jesse Nieminen. I'm also a co-founder and the chairman here at Bhima. And it's great to see so many of you joining us today to talk about this topic.
Definitely. Today's webinar is held in collaboration with Innovation Excellence, with whom we're happy to continue our partnership. We actually did a webinar earlier this year on how different innovation practices can help transform the corporate culture. And if you're interested in that topic, it can be found at bhima.com. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please write those down in the questions section of GoToWebinar, and then we'll cover as many as we can in the end when we have a Q&A time slot available.
Yeah.
Before we dive into the meat of today's webinar, we'd like to say a few words about Bhima as a company. So we're a quickly growing SaaS vendor of idea and innovation management software. Our aim is to be the best tool out there for collecting, developing, and evaluating ideas. And we focus on ease of use, best-in-class user experience, and seamless adaptability to customer processes and different innovation requirements. And we've actually been ranked as #1 based on customer reviews in our own segment. But in general, we want to help organizations of different sizes be more successful in their innovation programs.
And that's part of why we're also keeping this webinar today.
Yeah, exactly. Today, we'll first start off with Jesse telling us a bit about research and theory, as well as our own experiences on why many companies fail in their innovation programs. We'll then continue on to discussing some of the foundations on how to build an innovation program. We'll then cover a practical customer case example of ours in the energy sector, and then finally some tips and tricks and practical examples on how you can get started and how you can sustain the momentum.
Yeah. So first, let's start off with a brief discussion on why exactly it is that so many innovation programs fail.
Sure.
So I think the biggest reason for that happening is something that we can all agree on, and that's that innovation is just really, really hard. And according to McKinsey's Global Innovation Study that was done a couple of years ago, only 6% of executives were satisfied with their innovation performance, and it probably isn't all just because they have high standards.
Yeah.
But what makes it so hard for larger organizations is that, unlike for startups, a single successful innovation isn't enough to really make an innovation program successful. For that to happen for a larger organization, it needs to churn out innovations on a consistent basis.
Yeah, and even for a startup, it's difficult to come up with that one successful innovation.
Now, we've seen hundreds of different innovation programs in our discussions with our customers and other companies throughout the years. And while many of them have been quite successful, there are also many that have struggled to really make an impact with their innovation activities. For some, culture has really been a big challenge. For others, they may not have had a reasonable strategy in place to tie it all together, and some simply haven't had the capabilities to execute on the ideas that they have. So it's often very different things that really end up accounting for the failure or success of the innovation program. And the best way that we've been able to summarize all of that is by borrowing the Karenina principle, which originally refers to happy and unhappy families. So when we bring that into the innovation context, what we mean by that is that all of the successful innovation programs seem to have one thing in common, and that is that they have a really holistic approach to innovation and don't really have any obvious holes in their game. And then the unsuccessful ones, on the other hand, typically fail for very different reasons. So what does that holistic approach then mean? We like to break innovation down into what we call the 4 key aspects of innovation. So the first is strategy, which basically in this case refers to the innovation strategy of the organization. Next, the capabilities mean the knowledge and skills of the employees you have, but it can also mean the other resources such as your budgets and things like that. As we mentioned, culture often plays a really big role in innovation, so that's certainly a factor here. And then finally, we have the structures, which are basically all of the practical things such as your organizational structure, processes, methods, and tools, whatever, you name it. And it's basically here if it relates to your innovation. And now when we have all of these 4 elements in place and they all are aligned with one another, then you'll already be well on your way to making innovation happen.
Exactly. And sort of if you're lacking in any of these 4 areas, that does increase the risk of your innovation program going towards the wrong track.
Exactly. Now, to shed a bit more light on this, we've also looked at around a dozen of the largest studies on corporate innovation that talk about the factors affecting innovation performance, either negatively or positively. And we've summarized the results for you here. So on the left-hand side, you see the numbers. They basically indicate how many of the studies found the given factor to be of significance for innovation performance. We've also mapped these factors to the 4 aspects that we just talked about. So it's quite easy for you to see that, as we mentioned, they can often be very different. Well, you can probably see that the structural issues, the ones in the green, are the most prevalent, but that is to be expected because there are so many different ways that you can do those things in practice, whereas well, you either have a solid strategy or you don't, and the same applies for things like culture and talent as well. So what does all of that mean? Well, there are a couple of implications. The first and the most obvious one is what we already talked about, which is that a lot of these different ways that you can fail, but to succeed, you really need to get the majority of these things right. And then the other one is that while strategy and culture are obviously crucial for success, and you shouldn't definitely ignore them, the majority of the challenges are often highly practical in nature once you get started with the work. And that's why Erkka will talk about those things in more detail later on in the webinar.
And actually, many of the structural elements, actually, if you get them right, they will help the cultural sides of things develop towards a more innovation-friendly position.
Exactly, and they build the capabilities for you and also help you refine the strategy that you already have in place. So they help certainly with all of the other things as well. So next, we'll go briefly into the theory of how to build a successful innovation program. And before we get started with that, we often hear people use the term innovation program quite liberally. So we thought it would be good to define that before we get any further on that. So the way we like to think about this is that an innovation program is the concrete manifestation of your innovation strategy. So it's basically a portfolio of initiatives that you're building in order to achieve those strategic goals that you have. Those initiatives can be anything and everything that you can think of. It can be idea challenges with a tool like Bhima. It can be corporate startup accelerators. It can be innovation labs. Basically, you name it. And that should probably give you a bit more context into the terminology that we're going to use throughout this webinar. Now, when you're first starting to create the innovation program, you certainly want to start with the big picture in mind. Your corporate strategy, the purpose of that is basically to tell where you want to be in the future and how you want to get there. And the innovation strategy is then the practical kind of like side of doing that in terms of building the future of your organization. It's just like one step down from the corporate strategy. And the reason why it's important to start with strategy is that depending on your strategic goals, the kind of innovation you're looking for can be very different. For example, if you're looking to increase your market share in your current market, you'll need a very different culture, very different capabilities, and very different structures than you would if you were about to enter and try to disrupt an entirely new industry.
Exactly, yeah.
So once you have a rough idea of where you want to go, the next step is to assess where you currently are. And this helps you better plot a course for developing the capabilities and the structures and all of the stuff that we've just talked about. And the traditional approach to looking at this is through an innovation maturity model, which is basically a linear model that tells how mature and established the innovation work in your company is. But we've found that to be a bit old-fashioned, as it's primarily suited for cases where you have a single process for all innovation work in your organization.
Yeah.
And if you look at any of the most innovative companies in the world today, be it Amazon, Google, Microsoft, you name it, they often have very different ways of innovating in practice. But the one thing that they always have in common is that there isn't just a single innovation process or a single unit responsible for all of that. So when we took all of that and adapted the innovation maturity model, we built this innovation maturity matrix that you're seeing here. And obviously the top innovators that we were just talking about, they are on the top right-hand corner. They basically have established ways of doing innovation, but more importantly, they have that at scale across all parts and all levels of the organization. On the other hand, if you look at many of the majority of the well-run established companies, they are usually on the top left-hand corner. They have well thought out processes for their R&D work, but they often have a hard time creating entirely new businesses out of that. And they usually aren't really able to scale that all across the organization either.
Yeah, exactly.
So the takeaway here is that if you want to aim for the best possible results with your innovation program, you want to aim for both scale and maturity.
Yeah.
And there is obviously more than one way to get there. So you need to create a roadmap that helps you in your specific case build the capabilities and the culture and the structures that help you get to those specific goals that you have. But it's something that Erkka will then tell you a little bit more about later on.
Sure.
Before we get there, I'm sure you know that it's of course a lot easier said than done. So many of the individual initiatives in your program and even more of the individual innovations within those programs will fail. But you can learn from every single one of those failures. And not only will you learn something valuable every time you do one of those things, you'll also have built some practical capabilities that are going to help you down the road.
Yeah.
So that can be acquiring new skills, building new processes, testing new methods, and using new tools, and so on. So
yeah,
the basic thing is that innovation is highly unpredictable. So while planning is really important, it's a lot easier to analyze something that's actually happened than it is to try to build everything and in advance and try to plan everything perfectly. Yeah, it just doesn't really work in the real life.
That's right.
So you should typically lean towards taking action and then stopping to reflect on what you've learned once you've done that. And the faster you can iterate this process, the faster you'll also deliver results with your program. So the two biggest keys to innovation success with your program are basically persistence and then the speed at which you move towards the goals that you ultimately have.
Exactly. Quite often when we talk about innovation management and managing innovations, people tend to confuse that with traditional R&D processes where you do manage all of the phases and tasks sequentially after one another, and you can quite well plan what's going to happen after each phase. When we talk about innovation, it's rather just managing the circumstances in which innovation is likely to happen or occur, and you create a foundation where certain initiatives can fail, and that's okay, and you learn from them. So innovation management is rather about managing that uncertainty and providing the
exactly
like probability for success.
Exactly. And that's what you've probably heard that people say that you can't manage innovation.
Yeah.
So you just can't manage it the same way that you would many of the more traditional activities in your organization. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do and you just have to hope for the best.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what we'll now be talking about quite a lot during the second half of our webinar. So we'll first go through a practical customer case example of ours, and focus primarily on an innovation initiative within the innovation program. And then in the last section of the webinar, we'll then talk about some of the best practices and sort of wrap up the things that we've talked about today. We've had, as Jesse mentioned, the pleasure of working with hundreds of organizations from around the world. We've seen countless of successful innovation programs, but we've also seen many that have failed. And many of the practical examples and practices that we have are basically based on those experiences with the customers. We, of course, never share any information about our customers without prior approval from them. And in today's example, we have agreed with the customer that we leave out details that would identify them as a company, and also, of course, all sensitive information. But we've made sure that there's enough left that you get a concrete understanding of the things that they did to establish their innovation program and run the initiative that we'll be talking about today. The company in question is operating in the energy sector in Central Europe. And they, as many companies in that field, have been quite like classic, have been driven by the classic model of the R&D work being done centrally, and then there's an organization that then operates and deploys those solutions out. And what they wanted to do was not necessarily get rid of those competencies that they currently have, but also to spread the innovation activity to the rest of their employees in order to get some fresh ideas and utilize the knowledge that's lying around the employees and the workforce all around the organization. So we could classify the starting point as being a traditional company in the maturity matrix that Jesse talked about, and then them wanting to transition over to the advanced section. So innovation happening across the organization.
Yeah. And if you think about that from like getting from the traditional to the advanced, it's not something that just happens with one like initiative.
Yeah.
So well, Erkka will talk about that in more detail a bit later, but they basically took the first step, and that's basically to try to engage the people in the field to kind of like build the culture of being more innovative and building the culture of contributing towards innovation, and not just saying that everyone in the field that, hey, you should try and start innovating new renewable solutions.
Yeah, that's right. And as Jesse said, the initiative that they carried out was in fact related to renewable energy solutions. Before jumping into the initiative itself, let's look at briefly at the innovation program in general that they have. Obviously, the innovation program is guided and should be guided by the innovation strategy of the company, which is furthermore derived from the corporate strategy itself. But this time we're not going to be talking about the strategic element, but rather the innovation program and what lies within it. And for this customer, they had structured their innovation program so that they actually had sub-programs within it. We're talking about an organization with several thousand people, so the innovation program in itself is actually quite complex. And what must be realized is that the innovation program in itself cannot just simply be executed in itself, but rather it's composed of different elements within it that actually need to be executed really well and managed in a structural way in order for the whole program to generate results and in order for it to progress in the direction that the strategy has been designed. And the sub innovation programs that they had, here are a few examples. One was related to sustainability and responsibility. One was about continuous improvement, and one was about new business concepts. And the whole program for them was managed by the corporate innovation director, who oversaw the whole program. And then the sub-programs were actually then managed by specialist innovation managers who were experts in that area, but also then of course possessed the sort of innovative capabilities of helping people to learn the innovation related competences. And within now the sustainability and responsibility sub-program, to which we'll be focusing now on, they had two example initiatives. One was an idea challenge on identifying renewable energy solution related ideas. And that was a 3-month challenge. And once it ended, they continued off with an accelerator program that then turned the end result of the idea challenge into concrete pilots and projects. But we'll now be focusing on the idea challenge in itself. And the tool that we oftentimes use when our customers are looking to start off with a new innovation initiative is our planning canvas, which is quite similar in a sense to, for instance, the business model canvas that many are aware of and have used in planning new business concepts. So we have several different key areas that should be acknowledged and planned in order for the whole structure to be clarified, and in order for you to make sure that you've thought about all of the relevant perspectives.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same concept as we talked about, being holistic with your whole innovation program and taking all of those different aspects into place. It's the exact same concept. It just applied for the individual initiative instead of the larger innovation program. And in this case, obviously, the components are a bit more concrete than they are on the top end, like larger innovation program level.
Yeah.
But the same basic principle still applies.
That's it. That's exactly right. And here in the next slide, you can see that we've now filled in the information for this customer company on how they planned the idea challenge initiative. We're not going to be going through all of this material, and obviously there was a lot more than what's written here, but the idea is to raise up a few key notions that are quite globally applicable that you should think about when launching a new innovation initiative within your innovation program. The first thing that we want to raise up is the theme of the initiative. We quite often see, unfortunately, that the initiative is guided by a theme that's too vague or on a too broad of a level, which then oftentimes results in the ideas that you get being sort of all over the board, or people just being confused that what should they focus on. It's perhaps best to be, or better to be, too narrow than too broad. So as an example here, what they wanted people to focus on was innovative and competitive renewable energy solutions capable of producing at least 3 megawatts per unit or farm. So that already rules out sort of household solar panels and small wind turbines and things like that. So they were talking about like commercial energy producing plants. So that's one key notion. The other is you're obviously going to need people to participate in the initiative and in your program in general. But now talking about this initiative, you should think about how are those people going to join in? How are they going to be participating in the innovation? And if you're using an idea management tool, obviously in this case they were using Bhima, they had the challenge of a lot of their people being out in the field, not sitting behind their computers, being able to type in ideas like in the midst of their normal work. So what they how they solved that issue was that they had company phones for a lot of those people, and then utilized the mobile user interface to then submit those ideas from the field, which actually didn't just enable the people to join in, but also for them to get a lot of fresh ideas with like photos of different types of solutions and things like that. Other examples might be that you would have a shared tablet somewhere where the team who doesn't necessarily have the corporate email addresses could then join in. But important to think about how are the people actually gonna participate and think about that in advance. The third area are the goals. You should have, in the best case, you should have goals for the initiative that are quantifiable. So they're measurable. In the end, when the program has ended, the initiative has ended, you're able to analyze whether or not you were actually successful, and how successful were you, what can you do differently next time in order to improve, and whether you can also reflect basically that were your goals realistic or not. In this case, the goals perhaps weren't all that realistic, but they had good analysis in the end.
Yeah, and it's better to be too ambitious than
that's it.
Too humble with the goals. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. Just being realistic in the end, but the ambition does drive innovation and to a higher level. Then one of my favorite topics is the timing, especially if you're running a time-boxed short innovation challenge of a month or 2 months, or you're just launching new innovation activity or a continuous innovation process. Be sure to do that at a time when there are no public holidays or festivities, or the business being really busy with some annual hurry season. So making sure that people actually have the chance to participate and they're not buried with other work at the moment. This is a challenge that we face quite often, that there's then some special event taking place which then distracts people. Then the responsibilities, or on the responsibilities, this is one of the areas that should definitely be done, or you should think about this quite well in advance, since oftentimes, let's say that we're talking about now the facilitators in the innovation initiative. You can't just necessarily tell them today that, okay, you'll be facilitating the discussion that takes place tomorrow, but oftentimes they need to be trained somehow so that they know how to approach the ideation, how to be constructive rather than just pushing people's ideas down, how to ask the right questions, what are the right questions, what's a quality idea. So training the people who are going to be playing the key roles in the initiative. And then finally, the results and reflection side of things. So you're not going to be improving if you don't analyze how well you did. And as we talked about managing innovation itself, so it's more about managing the way that you're able to learn and that people are able to participate. And if you don't analyze and improve, it's not gonna potentially go well in the long term. And in this case, one of the good things that they did was that they did analyze whether or not their original goals were realistic. They had one quite ambitious target of coming up with a new renewable energy solution that didn't yet exist in the market. Quite ambitious, didn't quite meet that, but they did get a larger quantity on the other measurable goals that they had. So it was a success all in all. And when we were planning this webinar and also discussed with a few of our followers, we were asked to provide an example roadmap or schedule on how a innovation initiative could be, or rather how an innovation program could be executed. But since, as we talked about, the structure of the big picture, the innovation program is guided by the innovation strategy, and the innovation program itself is typically built up of individual innovation initiatives that need to be orchestrated and run in a structured way. So having a sort of a roadmap or a schedule for the innovation program in itself, especially in a large organization, might be quite difficult to do, since the program itself is on a higher abstraction level. But then formulating a time-based plan, a schedule, or a project plan for a single innovation initiative is then, on the other hand, something that can be quite concrete and can be quite well explained.
Yeah, and with the innovation program at large, usually it's not something that really has an end date. You should really have that be a thing that you're continuing to do all the time,
right?
And it's just a continuous process of building the portfolio of the right initiatives that take you towards your goals ultimately. So it's just a matter of how much resources you have and how much capabilities you have, and then a matter of building those initiatives out to build that portfolio at large. But yeah, it's probably simpler to look at one of those and then kind of like reflect on that you need to have more than one of these ultimately in your program.
Exactly. And having said that, also single innovation initiatives can be continuous processes. So even they can have no end date to them. But especially the program should be something that you're not going to be quitting at some point, or otherwise you're basically essentially giving up on innovation.
Yeah.
But now looking at this example company in the energy sector and the idea challenge on identifying renewable energy solutions, new ideas for those, how they carried out the project or initiative was with this type of a plan and schedule. So here in the lower section, you can see the weeks, so it was, and the months. So this was, all in all, it took about 4 months to conduct the innovation challenge. And out of the 4 months, the innovation challenge was essentially open for 3 months. So they had 2 weeks about in the beginning and about 2 weeks in the end for preparation and then analysis, which is something that you obviously need to account for. And then they had different milestones in between the program that they planned in advance in order to make sure that they were always ready and knew what's going to happen beforehand, in order to be able to clarify to the participants what's going to happen, but also in order to analyze as they went through the challenge that are they on the right track. If they hadn't planned that in advance, they would have had no way of knowing that are they doing the right things. Since the topic was quite technical, and now they were opening up the innovation activity from the internal or closed R&D unit to the whole company, they actually needed to inform the participants of the existing renewable energy solutions that they had and the ones that they had in the backlog, so that people would be able to focus on new topics and not the ones that they were already working on. So they delivered or prepared a preliminary info package and then delivered that to the participants as a newsletter beforehand, before the whole challenge even started. And in that, they already did outline the upcoming initiative and then the schedule for it, so that people knew how to prepare.
Yeah, and it's especially important to also give a bit more context on why they're doing the whole thing. So what they did really well there was that they had explained well why they're doing the whole thing and the purpose behind that and what they were trying to achieve with it in practice as well, which really guides people in the whole initiative.
Yeah, exactly. Then in the beginning, they correctly took some time to train the facilitators who were going to take part in the second phase of the idea challenge. So how the overall structure was for the idea challenge was that they had about a month reserved for the idea generation, about 1 month reserved for developing a certain subset of the ideas within there, and then the last month prepared or reserved for evaluating the ideas. So they needed to train the people who were going to be encouraging the participants and facilitating the discussion, to train them in advance so that they were able to jump in at the correct times, and for the organizing team to be able to focus on managing the schedule and the communication rather than then needing to pull in the right resources and starting to train them. And obviously they used Bhima as their idea management tool. So if you're using an idea management tool to facilitate or to run a certain innovation initiative with, obviously it needs to be prepared somehow. Usually the technical setup is quite light. Most of the time goes into just planning how will the flow go through and how our instructions going to be set up, and testing that people understand the entire structure. So preparing that in advance. And then they also prepared the communication schedule as well as they could in advance, so that they had planned out when they were going to be sending instructions or newsletters, also the structures of those specific messages, and then who's going to be doing what and when, so that they had a clear understanding of what's going to take place during the different times. And already about a week before the go live date, they had the technical readiness to launch, so there were no like last minute panics and changes. And then when they went live, so this was done by releasing a newsletter in their intranet, or a piece of news in the intranet, as well as sending out an email to all of the participants who had corporate email addresses. And then for those who didn't, they made sure that the team leaders, especially out in the field, then informed their own team that this thing is now starting and what's expected of the people. And that's actually one key learning in all that. You can't just like sit back and hope that people, or expect that people will automatically join in and start creating value. It oftentimes requires for you to have those advocates in the field that help people, hold their hand and guide them to do the work. And once you get the momentum ongoing, then it basically the critical mass starts to draw in more people, and it starts to work better. The first sort of concrete element of the idea challenge was then the idea gathering, and in that phase the facilitators were basically focusing on encouraging people to join in that hadn't yet participated, that hadn't yet submitted an idea, also perhaps instructing people how to formulate an idea that they might have, and then the managing team send out an activation newsletter to all staff about a week or 2 weeks after the program had started, or the initiative had started, where they basically highlighted some key ideas that they had already gotten and some active participants. So that's a good way to motivate people. Before jumping to the next phase of the idea challenge, they had a pre-selection phase where they a group of experts basically just dismissed ideas that weren't realistic, so that the resources in the idea development phase could be focused on ideas that actually had potential in them. So those ideas that clearly just weren't plausible were basically dismissed.
And, or otherwise a good fit for the objectives of the specific campaign.
Exactly. Actually mostly related to that. And in the second phase, in the idea development phase, this is one of the most challenging phases whenever you're talking about ideation and innovation. So making sure that the idea has all of the relevant perspectives taken into account, and that it evolves to a state where it can be actually tested or evaluated, or a decision can be made somehow. So from the raw idea to something that actually has a concrete meaning and is well thought out. And in that, the facilitators played a large role. So making sure that for the ideas that were still missing key information, like the legal aspect or some technical question related to it, so making sure that the relevant experts came in and shared those views to the ideas. Yeah. And then at the end of the second phase, there was again a pre-selection, so some ideas that for instance just didn't get that discussion ongoing and basically had to stay at the original state were dismissed. And in any innovation initiative, you're going to be losing out on some of the ideas, but that's okay. You can't work on every single idea until it becomes something that's clear. So it's also about like probability, coming up with a expected set of ideas that are expected to create results.
Yeah, it's about prioritizing and finding the most likely ones to be reasonable for your specific goals.
Yeah. And then the last phase, since we're talking about renewable energy solutions, it's not that easy to create a prototype and test if it works, but it oftentimes is easy to, in some other way, like lightly evaluate whether or not something makes sense. So address a group of experts in the field and see if what they think of the idea and would they believe that it makes sense. Those people can also reside within your organization. So that's what they did. They gathered like qualitative evaluations for the ideas from different types of expert segments and customers as well. Then they had a set of numeric metrics based on which the large employee body basically evaluated the ideas and gave their opinion on how good the ideas were or how feasible the ideas were. And then they had some internal expert groups again analyzing the ideas or evaluating the ideas based on perhaps more advanced metrics as well.
Yeah. And if possible, you really want to make sure that you actually pilot these ideas in practice. It's a bit harder in this specific example, but even in this case, you can test out some of the things like the willingness of customers to pay for certain things. So in this case, if the customers are willing to pay a bit more extra to make sure that their energy is 100% renewable or something like that, those are things that you can pilot and test even without actually implementing the technical solution in the end. But you have to be a bit creative in finding ways to actually have real data to back up the evaluations of the ideas. If it's not possible or not feasible within your timeline or budget, then you'll just have to do with as many good guesses from experts as possible. But if at all possible, you really should try to get that real data.
Definitely. Yeah, completely agree. And then after the program or the idea challenge ended, meant the initiative ended, they had a wrap-up period during which they obviously analyzed the results that they had gotten and then used the output from the challenge to pitch that to the management and to the accelerator program that then basically continued from there. So a subset of the ideas that had been developed further and had been prioritized was then taken under work. And also from that process, not every single one of those ideas turned out to be a commercial business opportunity for them, but many of those still failed. But we're talking about big investments here and big business opportunities in general here. Yeah. So that basically like provides an overview of how a single innovation initiative within your program can be carried out, and also highlights basically the fact that this needs to be planned carefully. So if you're not running the individual initiatives well and in a structured way, it also means that you don't basically have control over the direction to which the innovation program itself is heading. So it's a lot of like hard work that needs to take place.
Yeah, the majority of it isn't very glamorous or are cool in that sense, but it's just something that you have to really like manage well in order for all of those things to work out in practice. So.
Yeah, that's right. Then next we'll basically form an overview of different best practices on how you can get started with an innovation initiative, and some of these apply to the program as well. And then as the second phase here, we'll talk about how do you basically sustain that momentum after you've gotten started, so that it doesn't turn out to be a one-hit wonder that you're active for 1 month and then everybody just forgets about innovation.
Yeah.
Which happens. What we're going to present here are basically 3 core elements related to being successful in an innovation initiative. The first thing is that you should have really crisp and practical goals for the initiative in order for people to be able to create value and content that's likely to help you reach the goals. So as we had the example about the power output of the renewable energy sources, another example could be that if you're looking to gather ideas related to just saving money rather than ideas that would reduce your operational cost by 10%, the second option or alternative here is already much more concrete and helps you get the right type of ideas.
Yeah. Without, if you're just looking for, or just saying that you just want to save on costs, people often really just talk about all of the practical, really minor things that really don't move the needle for you. So they can start talking about changing the coffee quality, and it just pisses half the people off. And the end result is that you really don't save that much. So if you focus on the ambition level here as well, so it's really important that you be very practical and crisp with the way that you set these goals.
Yeah, and remember to narrow it down rather than being too vague.
Yeah.
And another area related to the goals is we oftentimes say that when you're at least starting off with innovation, it's perhaps good to focus on incremental innovation rather than completely focusing on the radical or disruptive innovations. Of course, the last segment is usually what people have in mind when they think about innovation, that you're creating something that's going to change the whole market. But the challenge with that is that, and we talked a lot about this in our previous webinar, that it takes a long time and it's quite hard to maintain that management support all the way through for 5 years or several years. It doesn't evolve the capabilities, innovation capabilities of the organization that quickly. It usually ties a lot of resources in, both like personnel and then also a significant budget generally, and culture shifts in a slower pace. So you don't get as many iterations, and then it has a higher likelihood for you to fail and to lose that sort of initial interest towards innovation.
Yeah. And ultimately, you really want to have a healthy mix of both those ambitious long-term projects and then those incremental improvements that really drive quick results in your bottom line. But it's in the end a good mixture of innovation in all of the different time horizons. But it's often good to start with the incremental and build your capabilities and then move on to the more challenging things.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Then in addition to the goals, the second area that we wanted to discuss here was the role of communication. And this is generally probably one of the most common areas where companies are lacking, or what might even cause the failure of the whole program. If people don't understand what's expected of them, and why it's expected, and why their participation or their ideas are relevant for the company, and why they're relevant for them, it's very likely that your participation rates are going to be much lower than they could be, and the results from there won't be as good as they could be. So making sure that people understand what's expected of them, and then also that you remind them constantly. It's quite seldom that innovation is the daily work of anybody. If you're scaling the innovation across the organization, you might have a small team of people that are supposed to be innovating all the time, but when you're scaling that, you're competing with the daily fires that people need to put out and the long lists of unfinished tasks that they need to do. So it's perhaps not natural that they're always remembered to ideate. So you need to remind them. And also guide them, so teach them how to innovate, how to formulate ideas, how to be supportive. And then the last bit is the implementation process, and this basically means the part of the idea management cycle that starts off with picking the right ideas out of the bunch, making sure that somebody has responsibility over it, and somebody will actually do something to the idea, so implement it. Ideas themselves aren't worth anything. So if the example that we had, if they had just ended with the innovation challenge, so what they would have ended up with is a bunch of ideas, and perhaps their people learned something in that process, got to get acquainted with new energy solutions, but the company didn't necessarily get any business value out of it. So implementing the ideas is the area where the value actually comes from, and learning to do that in an agile way, so that you don't invest for too long in things that are not going to be working out, so that you learn how to fail quicker, learn how to collect feedback in an early phase, learn how to iterate quickly, make prototypes that don't require significant investments is a key area. So this is basically the three core areas for getting started, and the best practices related to those. Then once you've gotten started, once you've gotten off the ground with different innovation initiatives within the company, you need to think about how do you sustain that, and even how do you elevate it to the next level. And these now apply to the whole innovation program, so not just a single initiative, but rather the whole program. And we like to think about this through a model where we've divided the key areas into three sections. One is awareness, the second is alignment, and the third is delivery. And by awareness, we mean that people need to be constantly reminded and encouraged to participate. You don't want it to, again, to be just one initiative in which they joined, gave their ideas, and now they feel that they're done with it, but rather that they understand that innovation is something that doesn't end. It should last, and it should be recurring. So, and also that they don't get sort of sucked into their normal daily jobs, but remember to join in and take part in the upcoming initiatives. And one good way to do that, even when you're beginning with innovation, is to share some success stories from either your own company, if you have those available, or then from different players in the industry, even different industries. So that's one good way to motivate people and keep them informed. The second area of alignment. So this is really important and something that gets off track easily. As Jesse described in the beginning, the innovation strategy should be derived from the corporate strategy itself. Similarly, the KPIs and metrics that you use to steer the innovation program, those should be somehow linked or derived from the metrics that the executive board or the management is already following and measuring, and that shouldn't be something that you just identify that once and then you're good with it, but it's going to evolve, and you need to ensure that the innovation program is guided to the same direction that the company wishes to head, or otherwise you might end up in a situation where the innovation activity starts to drift away and become sort of a pet project that's on the side but not necessarily linked to the core activities. And also maintaining that management support so that you're not being sponsored by just one person in the executive board who might leave, and then you're out of luck. And the third area is the delivery side. We talked a lot about that in the previous slide. So and in the example as well. So understanding that it needs hard work to constantly remind people to progress the ideas, make sure that someone is responsible for the ideas, making sure that the ideas that are being worked on actually progress further, putting in the hard work to actually turn ideas into concrete results. And to monitor that progress constantly, come up with new ways of working. A bunch of examples exist out in the world. It just takes a bit of work to get familiar with them and to try them out. This concludes now the official section that we had for today's webinar. So we've covered basically why innovation programs sometimes fail, what are the building blocks of an innovation program, a concrete example of an innovation program, and then diving into a single initiative and understanding basically how the innovation program is structured, and then some best practices on getting started. We have a special offer for our listeners here today, and for the ones who will be listening to the recording as well. Could you say a few words about that?
Sure. So as a sort of like a small token of thank you for taking the time to join in, we're offering 2 free months of Bhima's premium plan with unlimited users for all of you who aren't customers yet. So unfortunately, if you are already a customer of Bhima, then this doesn't apply to you. But for everyone else, you can get 2 free months of unlimited Bhima use. You can just go to that link and sign up for our tool, and we'll then be in touch with you regarding the practicalities of that. We can dive into the questions. We have a few more minutes, so we can see what questions you had for us, and if we're not able to go through all of them here, I think we won't be able to do that. But we'll then try to get back to you via email as soon as possible to kind of like provide you with some answers on those after the webinar.
Let's start off with the first one.
We have one on what metrics or KPIs do you use to measure the innovation program or your success in that? So I think that's a really good question, and I think you briefly covered on that in the alignment section on the last slide on the level of the innovation program at large. So you really have to look at the big picture and make sure that the goals with the innovation program are aligned with the larger goals of the organization. But if we then look at the goals that we specifically use with our customers when we're working with them, we typically divide the metrics into 3 different sections. So we have basically activity metrics, process metrics, and impact metrics. So if we look at first the activity metrics, that can be anything like number of new ideas or comments or active users and so forth. The process metrics are then related to how the ideas move through the process in the different statuses within the process. So that can be anything like cycle times between the statuses, throughput in the process, the portfolio size of the whole program or the initiative, and then the value of the portfolio in that sense. The impact metrics are then the factual financial metrics or outcomes that you get out of those ideas, and obviously they are really important, and you ultimately want to measure those and make sure that they are aligned with the larger corporate goal. But the problem with that is that it really takes a long time for you to get any kind of meaningful results out of ideas. So if you just wait to get more, like results with the impact metrics, you'll have to wait for 6 months or a year or however long that may be, and there's really not much you can do before that. So you also want to track the impact and the process metrics, because they really help you make sure that you're moving in the right direction, that you're learning and improving all the time, and making sure that whatever you do gets better all the time. So I think that's really what we're looking for, and the exact numbers are or the exact metrics within those are again something that depend a bit on a case-by-case basis, but you really should have a healthy mix of all of those in your basically your dashboard and your KPIs.
Exactly, definitely. Unfortunately, quite often the answers to different types of how should this be done and what's the roadmap for achieving this and that in innovation, there very rarely is a concrete answer to that. It almost always depends on your goals as an organization, what industry you're in, what's the maturity of the innovation activity at the moment, what's your strategy, how is the culture, and so forth. So it's always quite complex. So
basically it depends.
That's it. We had a few more questions as well, but since our time is up, so it's now 1 hour into the webinar, we'll be sending out answers via email. There was one quick question that we can cover, that will the slides be available after the session? So yeah, we will basically share the slides, I think, and recording of the webinar as well.
Yeah, you'll be receiving an email with links to both tomorrow at some point.
Yeah, good. Hey, thank you so much from our behalf on joining in today and listening, and for the questions as well. We've had a lot of fun preparing and holding this webinar for you. Hopefully you got some useful insights and information out of it, and we'll be looking to engage with you again in the future when we have our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.